Sai Island in Sudan. It was dominated by ancient Egyptians at some points in its history. In these points, when it was dominated, it showed itself to be a very useful place strategically. The people who decided that these people, specifically inside of Sudan, needed to be part of the empire were several. Why? Well, firstly, they traveled through the Nile, and the Nile had been used for years as a trading port. Some pharaohs even thought and wrote down that they wanted to travel as far south as the Nile goes. Now, one thing they recognized is that a lot of trade was coming through the Nile through other Nubian or Sudanese tribes. These Sudanese tribes would trade with one another. Sai Island is interesting because it is a breakthrough inside of the islands of the Nile. In other words, the river goes around the island inside of the Nile. And so you cannot miss it when traveling there, which is why some of the oldest artifacts from ancient Egypt are on Sai Island in 1800 BC. Now, of course, this island played a huge role in the future, as we will see Ottoman people later on come onto this island and establish themselves in the 1500s. And we have many, many other people from other places who land here. Two things are very important. The first one being that the people of Sudan were not isolated in terms of communication. We find, of course, the Hyksos communicating with the Nubians. And then, secondly, we have the Mitanni mentioning the Nubians to the Egyptians. The Bible, of course, mentions Sudanese people over and over again, and it mentions other locations like Punt inside of the Bible. And so we know that this place was not unfamiliar. It was not a place where people did not know about it. And remember, Egypt and Sudan within the Bible are termed together always. Now, I mentioned this in my Nubian files, and you can watch that. It's like 3 hours long, it's easy to find. I mentioned this, but it bears repeating. Now, remember, what happened is the Hyksos come in, they start taking over some places. Avarice is probably one of them that are under threat, and the Nubians, who are living under, in their opinion, under the thumb of the Egyptians, they want freedom. They want to be completely on their own. And so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they form an alliance with these Asiatics. This is not the first time they've done this before, by the way, as in ancient times, like I said, there has always been a connection between Asians in terms of communication and Nubians. Not people, but knowledge of one another. Nubians were just as aware. And another thing this proves, by the way, is that there was writing in these parts of Nubia as old as you can think. And of course, Nubia has always had writing. But one of the things that I don't like is when you go and look at how a lot of scholars talk about Nubia, they talk about it as if it was a illiterate place. And of course, just like Egypt, the majority of people would have not been able to write. But just like Egypt, we find hieroglyphics in this area all over the place. Some of these places in Asia have actually gone in history to write down exactly what they saw in Nubia. Interestingly, only a few of them mention their jet black color, and only a few of them actually physically draw them and make any real separation between themselves and the people in Asia. Everybody recognizes everybody at the time as human. Now, obviously, some people just point it out because they're like, yo, the Nubians are something else compared to almost everybody else we've ever seen. But they say this about the Egyptians as well. Now, of course, the appearance of these Nubians would be striking even in Africa. And actually, when they went to Africa, because many different types of Sudanese type people did go to other parts of Africa, they were striking to the populations because you will notice names that are given to several of these people. So in Africa, there's words that are given to several tribes depending on how tall they are. So you get umdwa for some of the shorter ones, and then there's not a universal term, but there are terms for extremely tall tribes, which of course these Nilotic type people would fall directly into that type of tribal classification. So if we read this, we can see that Kamose from 1552 to 1050 BC, the last king of the 17th dynasty, whose words to his council are recorded in a commemorative monument, the so-called First Kamose Stela erected in the Temple of Karnak. And this is what he says. To what purpose do I contemplate it? This my strength, when there is one chief in avarice and another in Cush, and I sit here, united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each possessing his slice of Egypt, dividing the land with me, presaging the end of Egypt's period of humiliation. These bitter words mark, in retrospect, the beginning of an extraordinarily determined drive by the Thebans not only to recover what they had lost, and also in a buffer zone in the south before they turned north to harass the Hyksos. Kamose's achievements are commemorated in at least three great stelae set up in Karnak. The first is quoted on the preceding page. The second records the content of the letter addressed to the ruler of Kush from the Hyksos overlord Ipepi that was intercepted by Kamose's agents. In it, Pepe refers to the unprovoked violence perpetual against both their lands by Kamose and urges his Kushite brother to attack Kamose from the south while he himself distracts him in the north. In this way, Ipepi says, we shall share the towns of this Egypt. One can only speculate about what such a coordinated response might have achieved if it had been successful, probably the end of the Theban dynasty, and of course of Egyptian history, very different from the one we know. But no such response materialized, and events proved fatal for the Hyksos and eventually for the kingdom of Kush. Interestingly, I disagree a little bit with what they're saying, but there's a couple things here that are interesting. Let's start with the first one. Let's not give a top number because I think there's more points that I'll make. The first point that he makes that I think is very interesting is this idea that had Kush and the Hyksos from the Asiatics, had they come in at the same time and occupied the lands, they would have completely eradicated ancient Egypt as we know it, which is a strong statement, especially given the fact that Egypt had been attacked several times successfully and still bounced back. I think that is a very strong thing to say. I think it's possible, though, that the type of Egypt that we would have had after that would not be as isolated in history. I think because after that they would have had deep histories both in the Sudan type regions and in the Asiatic regions. They probably would have expanded earlier than they did, in the periods to come. They had these multiple people. And remember, once those periods came, we find over and over again names of Egyptian women, and we find people from outside. For example, the Jews that are found inside of Sudan, inside of Nubia, we find Jewish people. So there was a Jewish Sudan alliance at one point, and we find many people Arab Sudan alliance, all of that. We would have found those earlier because there's been over and over again escapes from regions. So Sudanese people, when they need to run away, where do they go? They would go somewhere deep in Africa, especially when the Persians came. Now, remember, the Persians were latecomers into this region of Africa, but when they came strong. And probably the fact that the Sudanic type people had a place to run away to, right? When they came to Egypt, they thought they were just going to take over and then that would be it. But then when they took over, the Sudan people ran, and no matter how far they pursued them, there was always space to run, which is probably why the Persians came up with the idea of going around the entire continent of Africa. Now, even though my point was that Nubia was not a secret to the world, some parts of Africa were. Remember, we have writing from ancient Egypt that has all these names of parts of Africa that today we can't even identify because they didn't give clear directions of where they are. We know that some of them are in the east, we know some of them are in the west. If we looked at that table of races of Persians, remember that's late in history. So all of these other places had been traveled to several times by this date by the ancient Egyptians, but still like the furthest parts of Libya are unknown to the Persians. Like the Persians know about Libya, but they know about close Libya. They know about Nubia, but they don't know about faraway Nubia. They don't know about Punt. They don't know about Central Africa, which is written with certain names. So they mention a area that you have to go west from Egypt, southwest, and then you're going to end up there. One of the first places you would end up in is southern Libya. In southern Libya, what you're going to find is people called the Temahu, and these people, they have deep connections with ancient Egypt in terms of communication, land allocation, and war. These people as well have been summoned and utilized as gods in these areas as well. Going further south, you find Ya, a location in Africa, which again we have no idea exactly where it is. We know though that it is in a very different location than almost all the other ones that have been put out there, and possibly it represents Central Africans. In fact, there's a lot of words that have been used outside of Africa or any of those words, like Southerners or words like that, which have been used for people who come deep from Africa, representing a completely different population at one point. Point number two, it's actually very interesting that what they're talking about is an alliance of sharing. So basically saying they're going to share the spoils of war. Now, this might be a trap, right? Divide and conquer. They use the people in the south to take over, and then they take over the people in the south. But of course, this is speculation from my part. Again, the part that makes it very interesting is the fact that they're trying to form an alliance, and this is behind the back of the people in um Egypt. So let's think about this for a second. How do you get a letter to travel to Nubia without it going through Egypt? The answer is you can't. So what happened to this letter? Well, it got intercepted. The pharaoh found it, and it got intercepted and it got stopped. And this kind of led to the beginning of the end of the Hyksos in Egypt, and also, as they write there, the beginning of the end of the kingdom of Cush. But this end is kind of a beginning in a weird way for both of the Asiatic and the southern areas. But before we go there, I want to mention one more point, which is why didn't they get the help from other Asiatic people? For example, why didn't they go to Arabia? Why didn't they go to the Israelites? Why didn't they go to any of those people? And the answer is probably because the Nubians are considered very close strategically to the ancient Egyptians. And it's always this closeness that bothers me about, when people say Egypt is completely separate from the rest of Africa. No, it's almost it's literally in the same place as other African tribes sitting on top of each other. Some of the most earliest mentions of Bedouins, or the people who come from the rising sun, in ancient Egypt mention Bedouin tribes, so Arab tribes, in alliance with African tribes. So these Sudanese, Kushite type people working together with the Arabs in some locations. But again, that's a story for another day. I think I'll leave it here because I have to make a video about West Africa and a video about Kuwait and its history.